Now, for a few housekeeping notes before we start, you are most welcome to leave your cameras on, but please keep the mics muted while the program is ongoing. There will be a time for Q&A nearer the end of the session, so please feel free to post your questions in the chat at any time. And just a small side note, we would appreciate you using your real names as your display names if you are comfortable doing so, as I understand this is the first time that many of us are meeting one another. And lastly, this webinar will be recorded and posted online. So to open today's book launch, we would now like to invite Dr. Zvi Ruder, World Scientific Senior Executive Publisher, to say a few words. Dr. Ruder, please.
Yes, thanks very much, Sian. I just wanted to join my colleagues at World Scientific in welcoming all of you to this launch of a very important publication. And to say a few words, first of all, that we are delighted and honored to have Professor Zhu, whom I have known now for many years, as our author. He is a very prolific author who has published with us quite a few books of different types before, and we hope that in the future this cooperation will continue. But this specific publication especially stands out because it is so comprehensive in nature. In addition to very high quality of research that is reflected in all the volumes here, the comprehensiveness of the coverage of different topics, all of which are burning, I would say, as far as their importance today, is just amazing. Because, as you know, it covers spans from security to sustainability to environmental issues to innovation, entrepreneurship, and even to healthcare related, COVID related policies. And from the other perspective, I also would like to say that World Scientific was a uniquely suited publishing house for this kind of publications. And perhaps to give you, as authors of, that contributed to this publication, a little bit more information about World Scientific, because it's a unique publisher in many aspects. It's a global publisher, of course. It operates globally, including in the Americas, in Europe, but especially it is unique and well known because it's the biggest scientific publisher in Asia. As you know, and so this specific publication that was edited by Zhiqun sort of uniquely suited for World Scientific as its home. World Scientific publishes about 500, 600 new book titles every year, and about 140, 150 scientific journals in different fields. And it's especially well known for a few features. One is that it's historically been associated with publication of Nobel Prize laureates in different areas. Also because of its focus in the social sciences and also in the physical sciences. And in the social sciences, the program covering Asia-related aspects, both in economics, in finance, in policy, in business, in management, in innovation, is especially strong. And so I just wanted to give you a little bit of this information so that in the future, if you have your own publishing plans, please consider World Scientific as a sort of uniquely suited publisher for your for these plans. Another issue also I would like to mention that as far as book type publications, World Scientific is interested in both educational materials and in other types of books. And one of the important types of books for us, in addition to edited volumes and monographs and textbooks and so on, is multi-reference sets, publications of the type that we are launching today, that was edited by Zhiqun and to which you all contributed. And so thank you very much again for your contributions and for giving us this opportunity to publish Zhiqun's wonderful work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sibi. And now I would like to invite World Scientific's desk editor of the book, Ms. Tahira Altaf, to share some of her thoughts and reflections on the project process. Tahira, please.
Right. A very good and warm evening to Prof. Zhiqun, my colleagues, Dr. Zoe Ruder, Giltian, and the speakers and guests who are here with us today for the celebration of the launch of the multi-reference set, Security, Development, and Sustainability in Asia. So as introduced, I am Tahira, and I was the desk editor who worked with Prof. Zhu for the publication of this book. And it has been a great honor working together with him and the fellow contributors for this monumental and comprehensive work, which I am very certain is going to be an important addition to the field of Asian studies in this post-COVID world for both scholars and students of the field. So we at World Scientific are very excited to launch the book with you today, and we are looking forward to future collaborations with Prof. Zhu and the contributors. And we have an exciting panel session planned for you today, which we hope will be informative and enjoyable. And before we move on, just a short announcement to the contributors of this volume. The set has already been published, and we are currently collecting the mailing addresses for the contributors so that we can arrange for the complimentary sets to be delivered on time, hopefully by the end of this year and before the holiday season. You may send your delivery details to Prof. Zhu, who will then be sharing it with me. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Tahira. And now please join me in welcoming Professor Zhiqun Zhu to deliver the editor's address. Professor Zhu is a professor of political science and international relations at Bucknell University, USA. He is the author and editor of a dozen books and has received many research fellowships and grants, including most recently a Fulbright US Scholar Award to Australia. His leadership has culminated in the major reference set, Security, Development, and Sustainability in Asia, which we celebrate today. Prof. Zhu, please.
Thank you, Zan. Hello, everybody. So nice to see you all here. I'm just so happy that the 3-volume reference set is to be officially launched today. And we just heard from Ms. Tahira. Actually, the books are already published. So I'm going to also announce it in our email group, and everybody please send me your mailing address. So hopefully you can get the books before the holidays. And actually everybody will get the whole set, the 3 volumes in the set. I'd like to thank World Scientific Publishing and especially Senior Executive Publisher, Dr. Zvi Luder, for the opportunity to edit this major reference work. Dr. Ruder, I don't know if you still remember, but I think it was more than 11 years ago, in June 2011, when you first reached out to me with the idea of publishing a major reference work on Asian political economy. You and I discussed what key topics should be included. So in 2014, the 4-volume major reference work titled Globalization, Development, and Security in Asia was published. I guess the books have been well received, and there is an enduring and perhaps growing reader interest in the topics. That's why I think, Dr. Ruder, you reached out to me again about 2 years ago to invite me to edit a new edition of the reference set. Since I enjoy working with him and World Scientific, and since editing this reference set really helps my own research and teaching, I agreed without hesitation. So here we are, the new 3-volume reference set on major policy and development issues of 21st century Asia. It's ready to meet the readers. Thank you, Dr. Ruder, for conceiving this idea and for having total confidence in me to edit such a timely and important reference set. I wish to thank the editorial and marketing team at World Scientific for ensuring the smooth production and promotion of this project. Thank you, Ms. Zhian Teo, for helping organize today's event and advertise the reference set. Without your meticulous preparation, we would not have been able to launch the books today. Thank you, Ms. Tahira Altaf, the desk editor, and your colleagues, especially Anand, the copy editor, who is not here, for carefully going through the manuscript page by page to ensure the quality of the books. Now, speaking of the quality, I wish to thank all the 46 contributors for your hard work. Just hear these names and you will know that the quality of their chapters and the whole reference set is guaranteed. We have Robert Sutter, Dennis Hickey, Stephen Nagy, Steve Jackson, Bali Deepak, Mary Alice Haddad, Robert Daly, Nader Habibi, Bruce Bechtel, Yiwei Wang, Ming Ye. The list goes on. I'm sorry, I cannot call everybody's names, otherwise we'll not have time to hear them to talk about their chapters. Contributors, you are the best. I'm truly lucky to have the opportunity to have been working with you. This is such a dream team. You are invited to contribute, not because you are my friends or colleagues. Well, some of you are actually, right? You are invited mainly because of the quality of your research and your expertise in your fields. You are distinguished scholars, experts, or practitioners in international relations, political science, history, economics, anthropology, mass communication, environmental science, development studies, women and gender studies, etc. I'm so glad you accepted my invitation and became part of this multidisciplinary project. So we are here today, not just to launch the 3-volume major reference set. We are really celebrating the wonderful teamwork that has led to the publication of the books. This major reference set has 3 volumes. They are not typical research monographs or textbooks. They are theory-inspired empirical studies that reflect the current state of Asian political economy. So I think they can serve as textbooks, and of course, they will be very useful as a reference for research. Volume 1 unpacks and examines geopolitics and foreign policies of key Asian states in response to major security challenges today, especially with the intensification of US-China competition. Volume 2 covers geoeconomics, entrepreneurship, regional integration, and development models in Asia. Topics include trade, investment, innovation, and regional cooperation. Those are essential elements to Asia's continued success. Volume 3 offers a critical overview of environment, public health, and human security in Asia. Case studies are selected from countries that are at different stages of development. and are facing different environmental and human security challenges now. So with all the 3 volumes, I think the reference set covers most, if not all, major dimensions of Asia's political economy, regional security, and sustainable development. This multidisciplinary reference work is a fine example of international collaboration with contributors hailing from different parts of Asia, Australia, as well as North America and Europe. Sorry about the timing of this launch, but we try to accommodate most people from different parts of the world. I know, especially for example, Heidi in Australia, it's past 11 p.m. Sorry about that. But anyway, good job, everybody. Once again, I want to thank all the contributors for your excellent work. It's been a great experience working with you in the past couple of years. I'd also like to thank my family for their unconditional love and support, which makes it possible for me to work on this project and others. Finally, I'd like to thank my students and colleagues at Bucknell University for their continued interest in my teaching and research. Thank you for your invaluable support for what I do. You are really a great source of inspiration and motivation for me. And I think that concludes my remarks. Thank you very much, everybody. Now back to you, Zhiqun.
Thank you, Prof. Zhu. I think that must be one of the most heartwarming editor's addresses I have ever heard, and I'm sure all of you would agree with that. And today we are very privileged to also have contributors from all 3 volumes to share on the important topics that this reference set covers, as well as we are hoping providing some glimpses behind the scenes that I'm sure all of you have to share. So now Prof. Zhu will be introducing the contributors that we'll be sharing, and thereafter we shall pass the time to the contributors to share on their respective volumes. Prof. Zhu?
Okay, thank you, Zhiqun. I'd like to invite 7 contributing authors to briefly introduce their chapters. Each of them will speak for about 5 minutes. And after that, if any other contributors would like to say something about your chapter or any related topics, you are most welcome. We also hope to have a few minutes for Q&A and discussions before we officially launch the books and conclude our session today. So let's get started following the order on the slides. First, we are very honored to have Professor Robert Sutter from George Washington University. He doesn't need any introduction, you know. So Professor Sutter, please.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to be part of this group, and I thank Professor Zhu for inviting me to be part of it. I had the honor to do the chapter that dealt with emerging China changes course, regional and global implications. And the main argument here is that there are these drivers that are driving China to do what it's been doing over the past, particularly the past decade under the Xi Jinping government. And examining this and looking at the forecast of this, and as we look at it, what you see, and particularly in the latest Chinese Communist Party Congress, is full speed ahead for what Xi Jinping has been doing at this time. And often people will look at this and say, well, then China has this plan. They've had this plan for a long time, and they're carrying out these objectives, and that's what's been guiding them. And the article looks at this with a little skepticism, because as a person who spent a lot of time monitoring the different changes in Chinese foreign relations over the last 70 years, you find many changes. And what I argue in the paper is that, in the article, is that watch the circumstances. The circumstances in which China rises are very important. And so what I'm going to try to do is just underline that a little bit. And I think what we find is that the circumstances, the drives of China and Xi Jinping are very clear. But what's happened? Well, I work in Washington, D.C., and what you find in Washington, D.C. is a circumstance that's going to have a tremendous impact on China. And it's emerged over the last 5 years. It's a consensus among the executive branch and the congressional branch in both the Republican administration and a Democratic administration that the United States has to take a very different approach in dealing with China. And you're seeing the manifestations of this. 2022 has been really a banner year in doing this sort of thing. And what it is basically that from the American side, the Xi Jinping government has been taking advantage of America being lax in the face of a whole slew of challenges. And the fundamental challenges are really, they cluster into 3 areas. There's the security challenge, where China wants to dominate Asia. And this is something the US has opposed for a very long time. Secondly is the economic practices of China. And the high point here, of course, is the competition over high technology. And the thinking that drives this in the United States is that if China captures the high technology area, if they become the leader in that, then the American economy, which is very heavily dependent on this, will be subservient to China. But even more important is the thinking that those technologies are absolutely essential for defense, for the military. And therefore, if China is the high technology leader, it will be the leader militarily. And the Americans will be subservient to China, or dominant, if you want to put it in a blunt term. And so the American consensus is they don't want to be dominated by China. And they're working very hard on this. And there's a bipartisan agreement in the Congress and the executive branch on this matter. And it's going forward. And you're seeing manifestations of it every week. You see a new manifestation. And so the bottom line of my argument in the article is those circumstances are going to change China's approach. They're going to have to adjust to that, just like they had to adjust to other things that came along that get in the way of their, well, China Dream is the current title that encompasses what the Chinese government has desired. And so, and folks, what this means is that the Americans will not be passive as they have been on Chinese economic practices. They will not be passive on a whole slew of governance challenges that China poses. And what this means is that the Chinese government is going to react very negatively to this. And there's going to be more tension. And we're going to just have more tension characterizing US-China relations, and I think more tension in the region as a whole, looking out over the next couple of years. So thank you for the opportunity to summarize what I say in the chapter. And thanks again for allowing me to be part of this project.
Thank you, Professor Sutter. So it looks like the prospect is not very bright in the future. Next, we have Professor Song-Yong Oh from Bryn Mawr College. Maybe you will offer something more promising to us. Professor Oh, please.
I'll try my best. Hello, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be part of this academic endeavor. And I also like to thank Professor Zhu for his leadership. So my chapter is titled Between the Eagle and the Dragon, South Korea's Strategic Dilemma in its Pursuit for Technological Upgrading. So in my chapter, I discuss how South Korea, one of the leading countries in information and communications technology, navigates the daunting task of upgrading its industrial structure in the face of escalating US-China rivalry that Professor Sutter, discussed earlier. So South Korea serves here as a representative example of middle powers in the Pacific region who are pressured to choose between the US, the most important military partner, and China, the most important economic partner. And existing literature discusses how middle powers are likely to choose a hedging strategy to avoid choosing one side in a rivalry between an existing and a rising power. And hedging has been Seoul's preferred strategic option, maintaining good terms with both big powers through a strong alliance with the US, while avoiding US-led initiatives that antagonize Beijing. But the escalating geopolitical rivalry provides narrowing room to take a hedging strategy. And I look at this in the context of technological upgrading. So the paper begins with an overview of how semiconductor and 5G network development, which are critical to the Korean economy, moved from the technical, commercial, and economic realm into the intense world of geoeconomics and geopolitics due to, number one, fierce national competition to lead the fourth industrial revolution. Number two, the US and China's technological competition to set the standards for the next generation of technology. And number three, the increasing dual use nature of technology of having both civil and military application. Then I move on to discuss the challenges and opportunities for Seoul in navigating the geopolitics of tech competition over semiconductor chips and 5G network. So in terms of challenges, the supply chain in information and technology are deeply interconnected across various countries. So divisive policy agenda towards decoupling of the US and China put a lot of pressure on the business practitioners and small and medium-sized countries. On the one hand, US's ban on Huawei can be a boon for Korean companies because Samsung, Korea's national champion, can be an alternative to Huawei's 5G in many countries. On the other hand, given the globalized nature of supply chain, Huawei is an important business partner, which accounts for 17% of Korea's electronics parts exports to China, following the 2018 data. It also provides 5G related equipment to one of the South Korea's largest wireless carriers called LG U+. So the current Korean governments maintain two positions. First, Seoul claims that it will work closely with Washington regarding the general security risks posed by 5G technology, while committing to not using Huawei in defense and intelligence sharing systems. But second, Seoul at the same time emphasizes private companies' freedom to innovate and grow in the long term. So the government maintains that the private companies should be independent from geopolitical considerations in deciding their business ties with Chinese companies like Huawei, instead of the government dictating their business and commercial terms. So as tricky as the current dilemma Korea faces in technological upgrading, I finally argue that Seoul has been presented with a unique opportunity to turn this predicament into a catalyst to reduce its vulnerability to external policy changes and shocks. So Seoul can build internal resilience by diversifying its supply chain and market destinations through China Plus One strategy, and diversifying industrial profiles away from semiconductor chips, which accounts for close to 25% of the total export of South Korea, as a way to redistribute the risks derived from political tension. And I finally argue that such a pivot is not just a business strategy for South Korea, but a matter of geopolitical importance. So I'm not sure whether I provided more rosy picture of the geopolitics in East Asia than Professor Sutter did, but yeah, that's what my paper is about. So thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this project.
Thank you, Professor Oh. So Professor Sutter and Professor Oh are from volume 1. So let's move to volume 2. We also have 2 contributing authors here to introduce their chapters. First, Professor Robert Daly from College of Idaho. Rob, please.
Great, thank you, Zhiqun. My chapter looks at the question of domestic political effects of regionalization in Southeast Asia. In particular, it looks at the ASEAN's codified commitments to promoting and protecting human rights, fundamental freedoms, and democracy, and then looks at those commitments in comparison to actual practice and the extent to which these ASEAN states are living up to those commitments. So I begin the chapter, point of departure is kind of looking at Southeast Asia's democratic deficit. And I ask a question. So all you out there listening, you can answer in your heads. We won't do this in the chat or anything, but which country in Southeast Asia is most democratic? You're probably thinking of countries that have a long history or an attempt of democratization, but my answer might be a bit surprising. I would argue it is definitely Timor-Leste, which is, of course, the region's newest country, but it's had 5 parliamentary elections, 5 presidential elections over a 2-decade period, successive civilian governments, alternating political parties, and it currently is the only country in Southeast Asia which Freedom House rates as free. All others are partly free or not free. So looking at Timor-Leste is kind of interesting because it happens to be the only country in Southeast Asia which is not a member of ASEAN. And it is seeking membership. It has been for quite a while, but it's not able to live up to the required human resources commitments. You need to join ASEAN, and some other criteria hasn't met yet, but it's trying. But I got thinking, how might ASEAN membership for Timor-Leste affect its own trajectory towards greater democratization? And the answer, when we look at ASEAN's commitments to human rights, fundamental freedoms, democracy, and their own actions, is that joining ASEAN wouldn't do much for Timor-Leste in terms of its democratization. In fact, once Timor-Leste joins ASEAN, and I think it will happen eventually, any illiberal governments in ASEAN will find very much safe harbor in ASEAN if they pursue policies or actions that are in violation of human rights or fundamental freedoms there in Timor-Leste. The heart of the chapter really looks at the codified commitments of ASEAN states in documents in their ASEAN Charter with relation to democracy and fundamental freedoms. You know, when ASEAN was founded in 1967, and it persisted for a number of decades without a lot of codification, just there was the Bangkok Declaration upon which it stood. There were no commitments to human rights, fundamental freedoms. It was clearly a coordinating effort with regionalization at its heart and economic interest at its heart, some political interest, but there weren't commitments to human rights, fundamental freedoms, or democracy. That all changed really in 2007 when ASEAN adopted the ASEAN Charter, and really trying to model the European Union, the African Union. It adopted this charter, gained legal personality internationally, and really surprising many, it began to adopt these commitments to human rights and fundamental freedoms through various documents, bodies, a Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, a ASEAN Human Rights Declaration, and then these commitments were quite clear. And what I find most interesting about it, and the kind of method of analysis I use in the paper, is the ASEAN can be measured, or its behavior can be measured on its own commitments. These aren't. I don't use Western standards of human rights or anything that outsiders or others might imagine or idealize as definitions of fundamental freedoms or human rights. These are ones that ASEAN states have committed to themselves. And then we look at the behavior of them. So the rest of the chapter looks at deficiencies in ASEAN's responses to Myanmar, to problems of political crisis in Thailand and the Philippines, and compares them. And at the end of the day, I kind of find some agreement with John Emerson of Stanford University, who I think says it best. He says, ASEAN has always been and remains an intergovernmental body, an incumbents club. To the extent that belonging to the association bestows legitimacy, the direct beneficiary is not society, but the regime that rules it, however civil the society and however uncivil the regime might be. So I had an enjoyable time putting this paper together. Thank you, Zhiqun, and everybody else.
Thank you, Rob. That's a great summary of your chapter. Next, let's move to Professor Nader Habibi from Brandeis University. He's an economist.
Yes, hello, and thank you, Dr. Zhu, for giving me this opportunity to participate to this really wonderful project. My chapter deals with the economic interactions of China with the Middle East region. And the unique aspect of this relationship compared to other regions that China is engaged with is oil. The region has become a major source of oil and natural gas resources for China. And as of 2020, 46% of China's oil imports came from the Middle East region. But the high oil revenues of the region means that the region is also an important market for Chinese products. We have seen a significant increase in Chinese exports to the Middle East region in the past 20 years, and also an important center for Chinese investments, and also a source of investment in China. In other words, there is a two-directional investment relationship, investment flow between the region and China. The volume of Chinese investments in the region between 2006 and 2022 amounts to $220 billion, very significant. And of that, about $102 billion are invested in energy sector. But China is now actively investing and cooperating with the Middle Eastern countries on other investments, other sectors of the economy, particularly in transportation and real estate. Investments in transportation on roads, railroads, and development of seaports is part of China's greater project, the Belt and Road Initiative. And some of the Middle Eastern countries are already important nodes in this network that China is trying to create all around the world. For example, Turkey and Iran sit on the transit route between China and Europe. They are referred to as the Middle Belt axis. Egypt and the Suez Canal is one of the most important hubs for both manufacturing and a transit passageway for Chinese trade with Europe. Among Middle Eastern countries, China's investments and trade relations are concentrated on two areas primarily. In the 6 countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council around Persian Gulf, and Egypt. The engagement with the so-called GCC countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and other small oil exporters is quite justifiable. They are major providers of oil and very important markets for China. And in recent years, China has moved towards introduction of advanced technology, such as digital investments by Huawei. The COVID pandemic also created an opportunity for China and these countries to engage in some joint investments. And China is now contributing to the development of healthcare systems in these countries. Another important center is Egypt. Not only China has contributed to the expansion of the Suez Canal, but a very important economic zone. The Jeddah-Suez economic zone is being created on the west bank of the Suez Canal, which will serve as a major cargo holding and also production center, manufacturing center, which would not only contribute to the Egyptian market, but it would be a center for export and re-export to Europe and Africa. Now, with the expansion of China's relations with Middle East region, the United States has begun to show sensitivity, as was mentioned by previous speakers. United States has directly engaged with some of its major allies in the region, such as Israel, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and to warn them and try to discourage them from becoming too dependent on China, especially for advanced technology. So in my opinion, the US-China competition is going to play out in the Middle East in the coming years for two reasons. First of all, similar to other regions, US is concerned about over-dependence on China in terms of technology, but even more important than that is that China depends on the region for its oil. Therefore, if there is any kind of escalation in US-China tensions, and even, God forbid, military confrontation, the United States would certainly concentrate on blocking or restricting the oil flow to China. Let me end with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Habibi. Let's move to volume 3 now. We have 3 contributing authors here to introduce their chapters. Let me invite Professor Mary Alice Haddad first from Wisting University to introduce her chapter.
Thanks so much. I'm also, like the other authors, very excited that this is finally coming out. It's really a treat to have been part of it. And it's such a great set of diverse chapters that cover a whole bunch of different angles on some pressing questions. So my chapter, which is the first one in the volume, is focused not on all the depressing things that everybody else is talking about, but actually on solutions and happy things. I am particularly looking at the way that city networks are operating from Asia and how those networks among cities are helping to find solutions to climate change and global health. This emerges from a current research project on city diplomacy, which involves municipal level connections across national boundaries. Sometimes these are bilateral connections, like a sister city relationship, and sometimes they're multilateral international organizations like C40, which is a big organization of about 100 mayors of cities from some of the largest cities in the world, and it is working to drive a global climate policy. So my chapter in the volume looks especially at 2 particular cases. One is of Kitakyushu and Surabaya, Indonesia, and the way that a sister city relationship helped solve a municipal solid waste problem in Surabaya and actually grew to a multinational network of more than 30 cities across Asia, Latin America, and Africa to address municipal solid waste issues in those cities. Today, though, I'll actually focus on how cities in East Asia and Asia more broadly helped the planet fight COVID-19. So I'll just sort of talk a little bit about how these city networks evolved and played a key role in the way that cities and people fought that virus. So as I'm sure all of you know, in Wuhan, the first case was identified on January 20th in 2020. And the first case outside of China showed up just 4 days later on January 24th in Seoul. And as you may remember, Seoul was one of the first hit, and it was hit very hard, very early in the pandemic. So before most other countries and cities had seen even a single case, Seoul was very actively using protocols that it had developed fighting the SARS and other viruses in its area to address the public health emergency. As it turns out, the mayor of Seoul at the time, Mayor Park Won-soo, had been very active in building Seoul's city diplomacy profile. He'd served in a lot of key roles in international city networks. He was ECLAE president. He was vice chair of C40. He'd been involved in a number of these organizations. A lot of them had been focused on climate issues in particular. He used his networks in these city organizations to try to get the word out about both the problems and also possible solutions to how cities can manage the COVID crisis. So on March 11, the WHO declared COVID a global pandemic, and just 10 days later, or 11 days later, Seoul went into a partial lockdown. You can probably remember the viral videos of the hazmat suits all over, and they're like spraying down the subways and spraying down all the surfaces as the rest of the world had not actually really been dealing with COVID. It was sort of this thing that was happening over in Asia and all those crazy Koreans that are doing all the spraying down. By the end of that week, C40, which was this climate-focused international organization, invited Mayor Park, who was vice chair at the time, to hold a virtual conference of C40 members in which Mayor Park could share Seoul's experience with the virus, since by this time, all the mayors in all these global cities knew that if they didn't have the pandemic in their city yet, it was coming very soon. So the Partnership for Healthy Cities, which is an international organization that was sponsored initially by the UN, started just 2 days later, or 3 days later, March 31st, invited Mayor Park and also other experts from Seoul to host a webinar. And that organization had 2 tracks of weekly events that got together city leaders. So one track was a weekly roundup in which cities and city leaders shared experiences. And the other was a technical track in which municipal level workers were sharing experience on a technical level for first responders in cities. On April 1st, just the next day, city hosts a Cities Against COVID-19 Global Summit. And by the end of that, 42 leaders had signed the Cities Against Pandemic Agreement. The United Cities and Local Governments, another one of these international city organizations, created a What Local Governments Need to Know guide and was constantly updating its website so that cities around the world, rich ones, poor ones, big ones, small ones, had a global resource in which that was gathering sort of the best knowledge around this. Bilateral agreements were also leveraged, things that had started off as sister cities in which, high school students from one town would go and the band would play in another town, and then some other high school students would come and visit. So these cultural arrangements were leveraged to solve and address public health emergencies. Oita in Japan sent 30,000 masks to its sister city, Wuhan, on January 27, before the global pandemic was even declared. And then in April, when Wuhan's situation was pretty much under control and the pandemic was now hitting Japan, Wuhan responded by sending Oita 53,000 masks. And these kinds of arrangements in which sister cities on one side of the planet that were having exposure to COVID were getting assistance from sister cities on the other side of the planet that didn't yet have a problem. And then that relationship was reversed when sister cities on one side of the planet, North America, Canada, the US, and elsewhere needed help, and folks in Asia were able to leverage that. So the kind of moral of the story in the chapter is essentially that a lot of policy becomes very political at the national level and is hard to make change in these global governance institutions. But a lot of the cities are making real change in their communities, and they're sharing those solutions with other cities. And so these city networks are really working around the world to make real positive change on some of these big global challenges. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Haddad. Thank you for offering some sort of a rosy picture here, not just a confrontation, competition, but there are some form of collaboration, cooperation among those cities and among those countries as well. Next, let's move to Dr. Nicole De Paula from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, as well as the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam, Germany. But I believe she's in Rome today, right? Nicole, please.
Yes, good afternoon from Rome. Yes, where I'm speaking today. Very pleased to be here. As we say, a good book is the book that's published. So congratulations to all of us. And I'm very pleased to share a little bit about our chapter called Accelerating a Resilient and Climate-Proof Future in Southeast Asia, the Value of the Planetary Health Approach. So the picture is not always positive these days. It's very hard to remain positive with so many crises, interconnected crises happening. But we hope that by presenting an innovative concept or framework of the planetary health, we can be more positive. So of course, I'm also speaking on behalf of my co-author, Dr. Stefanos Fotiou, and I'm very pleased to share some of the insights. So just to go straight to the case, I think we started with a very simple question in this chapter: is the Asian success, as we said, can be sustained? So we know that during the last decades, we see a lot of economic growth in the region, and poverty reduction, even a lot of increased healthcare access. And we see some reports of the Asia Development Bank that many countries in the region have actually reached middle income status by 2020. But we show in the chapter, and there are nice graphs there that I encourage all of you to take a look, that this fast progress is usually very much, of course, connected to the increase of gross production and productivity. But when you see this, what is it at the expense of? You see the environment is usually what we are losing in most of course, the region, but in Southeast Asia in particular. So this increasing, we give many examples. For example, taking care of connecting with the urban air pollution, lack of proper solid waste management, degradation of fresh water, soil erosion, contamination, biodiversity loss, of course, climate change, and many other things. But what's innovative about the chapter, and we still see being a little bit overlooked, is this connections between sustainability and public health. And that's one of the main contributions that we want to bring, the notion of planetary health into the region. So we frame is this Southeast Asia as a history of fast economic development, but slow sustainability. And one of the notions of this planetary health, we argue that the successful leaders of the post-pandemic world, that we do hope it is, hopefully could be more resilient, if we are if the leaders are coherently designing policies that enable health and environmental synergies at the same time we're taking care about equity. So at the core of this planetary health, what we say narrative, it's both, I wouldn't call a discipline, but it's an emerging scientific field, yet at the same time a social movement. But of course, the humans will only stay healthy if they conduct their economic activities within these physical limits that ensure the health also of the ecosystems. So we do that so far. This synergies between human health and environmental affairs are overlooked, as I mentioned, and throughout the chapter, we are pleased to share examples in the area of food systems, biodiversity loss, infectious diseases, land degradation, and antimicrobial resistance. I would like just to quickly say now both my co-author Stefanos and I, we work at the UN Food Systems Coordination Hub. We're not speaking on behalf of the hub. However, the theme of food system is a very interesting one. It's so cross-cutting, and we do have a paradox to show that the current agri-food systems, there are several inefficiencies, and it's at the same time really environmentally detrimental, poorly aligned with many of the nutritional needs. So we are in a situation, and of course now what we call the triple crisis, the triple planetary health crisis. Is not only climate, biodiversity, and pollution, but we see hunger going up. And at the same time, that obesity is also going up, and even in not only both in developing and developed countries, and the access to healthy diets, for example, being very much a problem in many of the regions. For example, the global incidence of diabetes increased 70% in the last 20 years. So we try to do is really connecting the dots between the crisis we're seeing that, of course, will impact security and the geopolitics now that all of our other colleagues were mentioning. It's a big part of this, of how much we can be and remain optimistic given this context. But I want to give just also quickly a few numbers when we're talking about this post-COVID. And the preventing pandemics, we saw a lot of attempts to, it's a lot of the surveillance, but we would like to argue that preventing pandemics is really a task that would need to consider these environmental determinants of health. And that's one of the key arguments also in this chapter. So just to give one number, so the costs of preventing future zoonotic outbreaks like COVID-19, if we could say and avoid deforestation and regulating wildlife trade, this would cost, for example, around 22 billion a year, which is basically 2% of the economic and mortality costs that we are having now with COVID-19 pandemic. We are basically spending 10 to 20 trillions of dollars to take care of this crisis. So the way forward, we introduced this notion of the planetary health diplomacy, which is also quite, there was a commentary that I wrote at the Lancet, the journal Lancet for Planetary Health, and we haven't seen much of this, what would be and how could we design a planetary health diplomacy, especially in the region. So there are, at the end of the chapter, some of the recommendations. I don't have the time to go over them, but just to highlight some of the aspects of this agenda that would like to invite ASEAN to consider this interlinkage in a bit more robust way. So you would embed long-term inclusivity in these recovery packages in the post-COVID world, right? We would have to prioritize bridging the digital divide across Southeast Asia. It would have to be the green economy as part of these recovery packages, which not only in the region, but in many areas, we see this decoupling. And finally, respect and fundamental human rights, protecting civil space for building forward together. We see a lot of this build back better, but I think is the building forward together is a better approach. We don't want to go back to the situation that we were. And adopt this nexus approach. You see normally how governments and institutions, they are still very divided. So we argue they need to break not only the institutional silos, but mental silos in connecting these agendas. And of course, take nature into account in public policies that are connected to public health. Finally, it was very interesting to see also that excessive consumption is now making us happier, and you see a lot of issues impacting the mental health aspect as well. So we conclude by saying that the planetary health really brings this knowledge about the negative impacts of environmental degradation on human health, but also offers some sort of philosophy of living that you really can empower and can offer a transformative approach for the way that we perceive not the health of the humans that cannot be disconnected from the health of ecosystems. So thank you very much again for being part of this. And we do hope that we can have some conversations after. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. Yes, we look forward to having more dialogues on that particular topic. But going back to our original schedule, we have the final, but certainly not the last, not the least speaker, my dear colleague from Bucknell University, Soundarya Chindavaram. Soundarya, please.
Thank you, Zhiqun. So thank you all for being here. And thank you to Zhiqun, my wonderful colleague at Bucknell University, for giving me the opportunity to be in dialogue with such a great bunch of scholars working on Asia and very sort of topical issues. So my chapter for the volume was dealing with India's COVID-19 response, but particularly sort of focusing on the subnational variation in terms of how that response worked, particularly during the first wave. So I located or explained effective COVID-19 response, particularly in the first wave, as a function of the interaction between state capacity and community capacity. But what I did was sort of situate it in the contextual specificity of what was happening locally in terms of politics and economic sort of compulsions that these states were facing, which, you know, is considerable. There's considerable variation in terms of what politics looks like across Indian states and what socioeconomic sort of factors look like and how they come into operation across these Indian states. So very briefly, what I want to, without going into the minutiae of all of the argumentation in the chapter, what I want to highlight is the three contributions that, in a sense, my chapter sort of makes. So the first one was normative. which it sort of brings to attention the problems that are uniquely faced by marginalized and disempowered populations within India who live in a state of precarity, and people who are systematically excluded from from mechanisms of formal politics of representation. So how do we sort of bring them into the conversation? Normatively, what should be the responsibility of governments, particularly in situations like this, but also outside of crises and disasters such as a pandemic, to kind of include these voices in terms of how they shore up state capacity. The second sort of aspect or contribution was a theoretical contribution. The pandemic is a rupture or thinking about politics as usual. It's a very significant exogenous shock to the system, and it kind of forces us to reevaluate many of the concepts in politics that we sort of hold to be true. So the chapter was kind of, forcing us, or in the chapter, what I try to do is reevaluate our definitions of what state capacity is, and how can states sort of galvanize the infrastructural resources that they have and the institutional capacity that they have and put it to good use in terms of, identifying what needs to be done in a crisis situation. So it's not just sort of adequate to have some of these resources, which of course is itself sort of a big ask in a country like India, where there's significant variation in terms of institutional capacity across states. But even for states who have capacity to be able to use it in effective ways. And this is kind of where the idea of synergistic state-society linkages comes in. How do we sort of connect institutional capacity and state capacity in a way that it kind of responds to the people, and how can participatory mechanisms at the grassroots level enable for this, this capacity to be implemented effectively? So that was kind of the second contribution. And thirdly, the way I tie this together is empirically and methodologically by looking at a case study of an outlier state in India. So I look at a state which paradoxically performed really well in kind of controlling and sort of responding to the COVID-19 situation in the first wave. But it's paradoxical because it's a state very famous for its chronic poverty and chronic underdevelopment issues. It does very poorly on human development outcomes, otherwise has faced famines and starvation deaths in its populations. And yet it sort of comes out on the top when we look at the first wave, and performs much better than some of the states that were predicted to kind of do well because of the kind of infrastructural resources and institutional capacity that they had. So I tie this back to kind of the unique, again, political situation that you see in the state, which is a very dominant political party system. And the fact that it's a state that's geographically located such that it has faced a lot of natural disasters over the years. It has been very prone to hurricanes and cyclones and faced a lot of sort of human, disasters, and therefore has had to forcibly sort of shore up its disaster management protocols. So in the process of that, it sort of ended up creating all of the things that need to happen for institutional capacity to be rolled out very effectively and very fast in situations such as this. But at the same time, what I point out is, even though in the short term, it kind of worked really well, but in terms of long-term sustainability of these development goals and sustainability of institutional state capacity, there are things that need to kind of be created that are much more deep-rooted than just, a short-term crisis management protocol. So this kind of comes back to the issue of not just sort of, we often see this debate in governance about, what is the best model of governance? Should it be sort of centralized technocratic top-down governance, or should we sort of be going the community-led sort of participatory mechanism kind of way? So what my chapter points out that, there has to be a balance between the two. What, crisis management protocols demonstrated in India, particularly in the state where that technocratic sort of centralized interventions do matter, creating capacity such as, hospitals, such as, increasing testing on the scale that you require, particularly in the face of seasonal migration and population movements across the country, sort of demand that, the state plays an effective role. But at the same time, a lot of this needs to be kind of situated in community-led implementation of this as well. So kind of tying those two together is the way to move forward. And that's kind of my sort of prognosis for how to deal not just with public health crises, but also kind of thinking about sustainable development and human security and development in the long term. I'll end there, and thank you very much. Over to Zhiqun.
Thank you, Sanaria. That's great. Since many other contributing authors are also here, and we still have some time, if there's no objection, may I invite a couple more people to speak? Okay, I'll go ahead. Okay, let me invite Professor Ming Ye from Boston University first to briefly introduce her chapter.
Okay. So I'm Ming Ye. I contributed a chapter in the volume 1. And I want to thank Zhiqun for the invitation and just for organizing this fantastic and very useful research, such balanced knowledge and exchange for us scholars and the faculties on working on the issue. So my chapter is titled Better Than Bipolar, US-China Competition from TPP to BRI and the Free and Open Indo-Pacific. So in this chapter, I speak kind of speak against the trend for decoupling, because in the last 10 plus years, US-China competition was already very intense. So this chapter traces the processes and critical junctures of the two competition. And what I argue was when the linkages and interdependence were very significant, as they represented by globalized elites, globalized think tanks, and globalized middle powers. And the great power competition actually at the critical junctures, the trajectory was more stabilizing. So the chapter itself maps out a more positive scenario for great power competition, but at the end pointing to very dark and dangerous trend of decoupling's impact on this strategic competition. So I've been using, so this volume, I just want to again thanks Zhiqun for organizing. I've been using Professor Satter's and Professor Wang Yiwei's chapters, and it's very good contrast in describing the situation that we're under in the US and China. That is, from US side, and the information or the discourse is very logical, right? That when China changes its behavior in the region, and thus the US and other countries reacted to China's rise and behavior. And Professor Wang Yiwei on the China side talks about the China paradox, and it really points out how China perceives and reacts to the dynamic. I find that juxtaposed chapters to be really useful for teaching students on China, US-China relations, that on one side it's seen as reaction, on the other side it will be seen as action and aggression, and we in that kind of discourse is just too limited nowadays in the US and in China. So lastly, I do have a plea for the editing teams and Professor Zhu, that is it's not after the launch. We should keep these volumes and this exchange, collaboration, and linkages alive. Because one of the pessimism I have is that the policy communities and politicized public and in many, in both China, US, and also many other countries. And so what we have here, for example, FOIP, right, the Indo-Pacific strategy is a very controversial subject, but the chapter in this volume gives very good balanced account for the different positions, nuances in the Indo-Pacific grouping. So I do hope this kind of linkage that we build. So thanks to Professor Zhu for all the efforts putting and the editing team. I hope we can keep these linkages and collaboration alive. So maybe if there are chances that you guys are coming to Boston, I'm happy to do an event here, or if there are events elsewhere in connection with various professional conferences that we as a scholarly communities across so many different countries and sectors and policy fields can keep this exchange alive. So thank you so much, Professor Zhu.
Thank you, Professor Ye. Yes, we'll try to keep this group alive, and we'll continue our conversations among ourselves. But also thank you for offering to host something, in Boston if we do visit you in Boston. Next, I would like to invite Professor Bali Deepak to introduce his chapter about India-China relations. Professor Deepak.
Thank you, Professor Zhu. May I join my fellow contributors to congratulate you for undertaking this Herculean task of producing such a seminal work and covering various facets. I would also like to congratulate World Scientific for producing these volumes. As far as my chapter is concerned, so it is titled India and China, a search for a new equilibrium. And I have taken a kaleidoscopic view of India-China relationship through its civilizational history and contemporary times. And I have argued that this is an extremely important relationship, especially the kind of reconfiguration of forces taking place around the world, and especially in Asia Pacific. And I make a couple of arguments. I'll briefly give 2 or 3 arguments. One is that India and China were able to build this equilibrium and understanding because especially during the initial years of China's reforms, both were at an equal footing as far as economic advancement and technological advancement is concerned. And both of them, so they were successful in building a couple of confidence building measures or crises, management based measures. But the second argument is that in the last 2 decades, or we can stretch it a little further, in 3 decades, that this equilibrium was lost owing to China making huge advancements as far as technology is concerned, as far as economy, and also defense. So there are these asymmetries in India-China relationship, and China feels that there are no compulsions for it to, agree to the kind of equilibrium and understanding that was built between the two. And the third argument I make that it would be impossible, for India and China to rebalance that relationship or the kind of approaches China has taken off late, asking India to put the border at its proper position, especially when 100,000 forces from both sides, they are at the borders, facing each other's eyeball to eyeball. So under such circumstances, I argue that it would primarily depend on a couple of factors. One, the growth trajectory of India, whether it is able to bridge this gap, which we have talked about, and also the kind of cohesiveness if India is able to maintain inside India across various strata of the population. And finally, it would also depend on the kind of major power relationship that's built, especially India's relations with the United States and to some extent to Russia, and the middle powers, which one of our panelists was talking about. So these are some of the arguments I have given in my chapters. I'm excited to look forward for reading the chapters contributed by others. Thank you, Professor Zhu.
Thank you, Professor Deepak. I noticed that Professor Wang Yiwei is here. Maybe if everybody agrees, can we invite him just to say something very briefly about your chapter? Professor Wang, please.
Okay, thank you, Professor Zhu, and thank you for inviting me to join this, I think, very interesting, important project. And I hope to read this book maybe in Chinese, not just in English. Okay, I hope to. And also my student, Dang Taige, helped me a lot as a co-author. And also thanks for the scientific press, actually, which published my book, Haisang, Evaluation of the European Civilization 10 years ago. So it's also about my topic of the China paradox. I think it's very interesting for the COVID, why the COVID policy is different with particularly between China and the United States. I found that it's different understanding about the life and the living. In the US, the Declaration of Independence said all the men, women are created equal, created. Actually, the first sentence of the original draft of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights also saying that, but the Chinese changed that all the men and women are born equal. So when we talk about the human rights dispute, it's a different meaning of the human. Human God, at the contrary, China is the human and the heaven harmony. And they all under the heaven, they're different gods. But in the Bible, said that God created the heaven and the earth, and also man and woman. So the different narrative. Now about the 20-party Congress, of the great struggle, the self-revolution, many things. I think it's very interesting, actually, my book, my chapter, in general of this book, trace back the fundamental different understanding of the different civilizations. To go beyond the capitalist socialist ideology dispute, I draw your attention to maybe to read, I think to think further about how to solve this problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wang, for your very brief introduction. At this point, does anybody else, any other contributing authors would like to say something about your chapter or anything relevant?
Maybe Long Taige say something.
Hi, dear colleagues, dear professors, can you hear me? I'm Taige Long. I'm the co-author of the chapter 2 of volume 1. And what I want to add builds on what Professor Wang had said, was that we should make it clear from what perspective that we should look into this chapter. That is, I think our chapter is located is located in the literature of the cultural divergence between China or the Eastern world and the Western world. And in our chapter, I think Professor Wang and I had pointed out several divergence, like the several terms in international relations. Regarding these terms, maybe Chinese scholars and Western scholars may have a different understanding regarding these terms. And at the end of our chapter, we appeal for a reconciliation between the Chinese civilization and Western civilization. I think this is a normative calling, rather than some empirical research. And I think this is the bright future we are looking forward to. And but I think many in the way we got this bright future, there are many obstacles and challenges in way of this. So I think I also call for the colleagues and to think about this issue and to focus on and to do some further research regarding the China's paradox in the international discourse system. Thank you all.
Well, thank you, Professor Wang and Tiger Long. And I think, we all hope that we can find a way to bridge the Chinese civilization and Western civilization. And we do hope that China and Western countries can focus on cooperation rather than confrontation and competition. But I like the idea, Professor Wang, you mentioned that maybe we should, or somebody will translate this reference set into Chinese and other languages so that the books can reach a wider audience. At this point, Zhan, is there any questions in the chat room we can address?
Yes, I think there's one from Lin Ha, who is a graduate student from the International Christian University in International Relations. So maybe I will just read her question out and then you can respond to it. So she says, I find that there is a lot of literacy emphasizing China's rise and its threat. Do you think that this will only deepen the negative impression on China that may narrow the options of policymakers, which may not be beneficial, especially in terms of economic benefits for countries?
Okay, that's a great question. I will say something about this. Maybe others can chime in if you have any thoughts on this question. I think, first of all, this reference set is not just about China, right? And of course, China looms large, in many of the topics we cover, in many of the chapters we have here. But China is not the focus of this reference set. I mean, we have chapters covering Southeast Asia, as Professor Daly mentioned, right? Several chapters on South Asia, India. We also have chapters on Central Asia, right? And of course, China's relations with different parts of the world. So it's not just about China. Even in East Asia, we have chapters on Japan, Korean Peninsula and Taiwan Strait, right? So that's point number one. Number two, I don't think we are taking a particular position here, either to praise China or to trash China here. I think what we're trying to do here is to present the challenges associated with China's rise and intensifying U.S.-China competition, and of course, there are some of us who believe that this confrontation between the United States and China is inevitable, and others probably are more optimistic. So we don't take a particular stand here. We're just trying to present the challenges, even some people think a threat, right, associated with China, right, but also opportunities, really, associated with China's development. This, like the Belt Road Initiative, right, and China's expensive investment in different parts of the world, which create a lot of opportunities as well. So that, again, my point is that this is not the China-focused reference set. it covers many, many more topics, although China looms large. And also we don't take a particular stand about China here in our reference set. We're trying to be as objective as possible, as comprehensive as possible. And we leave that to the audience, to the readers to decide, what is the best approach. But we, in our chapters, we, mention some of the approaches to promote cooperation, to avoid confrontation, but it's not going to be easy. Anyway, that's my take on the question. Anybody else? Other contributing authors, other scholars here would like to say something about that question, whether this will deepen the negative image of China?
May I make a comment? First of all, in my opinion, if some of our analysis offers a negative assessment, it's because we are trying to be realistic, and we see that the rise of China has led to provocation of some US response, which, as was mentioned, is supported by various political groups. So in order to be realist and objective, we have to assess that. And secondly, in terms of negativity, I think just as the world is polarized, we have two different opinions about China. In some countries, I think the image of China would be positive and might even become more positive, depending on the impact of the Belt and Road Initiative. And in some other countries, it might become more negative, but unlikely that universally the image would become negative. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Any other questions?
I think there's one more from Jane Hu. Let me just read it out. Okay. Jane says the tension on the government level among countries such as, among countries such as US and China will not and should not slow down the exchanges and cooperations on the civilian level and among business communities. Do you foresee such an impact further down?
Thank you, Jan, for that wonderful question. I think you're right. You are talking about the relationship between China and the United States from different levels. I think at this point, the governmental level, we all know that the relationship is very difficult, very tense. But I think like you, I'm optimistic about the societal exchanges between the two sides. I think the people-to-people exchange, really brings us together. That's the closest bond, that bring the two countries together. And I hope that, of course, the COVID-19 has impacted the exchanges between the two sides. I hope that in the post-COVID world, I hope that China will lift the draconian measures soon, so that we can resume exchanges and people can travel to China, and people from China can travel to other parts of the world. So this people-to-people exchange really can help decrease the hostility between the two sides. I don't think this relationship between China and the United States, it's so important. I don't think this relationship should be dominated by politicians on both sides. This is so vital that we as global citizens have a responsibility to ensure that this relationship will be at least functional. They don't have to be friends. They don't have to like each other, but it's such a consequential relationship. They should not focus on confrontation, because it's going to be harmful to everybody, including the United States and China themselves. So what we as scholars here can do is perhaps to help promote exchanges between the two sides. I mean, the government probably is hopeless, right? I think we at the societal level, probably we can still do something to promote exchanges. Like Professor Haddad's chapter about this city network, yes, civil societies, individuals can do a lot to promote cooperation, because after all, we as individuals do share a lot, in common. And we don't want this relationship to be dominated, to be being hijacked by politicians. But unfortunately, we are not living in a good environment. The atmosphere in Washington and in Beijing is just terrible now. And I hope that things will improve in the years ahead. And overall, I'm pretty optimistic. I think, the relations between China and the United States will improve. And I think other countries would also like them to improve the relationship. Anyone else would like to say something? Professor Sutter,
Yeah, on this one, I have to intervene a little bit. The earlier expression of realism and being realistic about this situation, I think is important. And the representatives that are in Washington, they're not a clique of independent people in that sense. They represent their constituents. And the constituents are all over the country. And so what they're dealing with in this effort is basically to defend America against the various challenges that come from China. And so it's defending America that they're about. That's the number one thing. And this has, I think, broad support among the public in the country. I don't think this is something that people say, oh, why are you doing this? They did for a while, but they don't say that anymore because it's been seen as a very serious matter. And as a result of that, then I think these people-to-people exchanges are going to suffer as a result of that. This is going to limit that possibility. Part of the concern on the part of Americans and their representatives is that China's system has used these connections for the purpose of the party state. And this is something that, and it generally involves weakening the United States in the process. And this has happened everywhere in the United States. It's being seen everywhere. And so these people-to-people exchanges are overshadowed by this suspicion, which is backed by considerable evidence that the Chinese party state uses these kinds of connections for the purposes of the party state. And so, so what do you do about that? And this is a real problem. And I think that if you're defending America, if you really think that we're under threat, under danger, which I think they truly do, and I can explain that in depth if you wish. But the bottom line on this, then those exchanges, I think, will be restricted. I think the danger will be too much and will overwhelm the ability of these things to continue in a way that would be, and they can certainly continue. People are free to do whatever they want, but certain things will be illegal. Restrictions will apply in all sorts of areas. And I think the culprit from the American side will be the Chinese party state using these various exchanges for the purposes of the party state. I don't want to say that all these people doing it are motivated by that or even aware of this, but the fact is it does happen repeatedly. And this is the real, so therefore that's why I'm not so optimistic about this situation. I think it's, we're in for a period of where these people-to-people exchanges will be restricted to a considerable degree.
Thank you, Professor Sutter. Anybody else?
Can I say something to Dr. Sutter's comments about party state? When the Americans said the engagement policy failed, that means the wishful thinking failed. China is more China. It's more China-ized. It's not Americanized. It's Westernized, because China claims we are self-confidence of the Chinese dream and the Chinese modernization. And then the Americans portrayed China as similar to Soviet Union, you say a party state, which you dislike so much, opposite to the US model. Chinese identify as a civilization state. And in Chinese, a party actually is not a party, it's not for part, it's for the people. It's so that's, we say, the traditional Chinese, in my article, in my chapter also mentioned about that. It's a man-haven relationship, not the contract of the man and the god divisions of labors. In China, we say we have a 分工, not 分传. It's a not separation or check and balance in China, because we don't think about the man character is evil and the power is evil, so need to check and balance. In China, actually, this is not evil or kind. It's neutral of the mankind, and also for the power. So that's the reason we say the strong leadership of the President Xi, and then the American thing is authoritarian regime, whatever. So easily to use Americans as a reference, or you're on the right side of the history to portray China, and then many mistakes, not to respect China so much as a civilization. So in China, in US actually, there's not so many sinologists like Fairbank or Luxembourg. Now it's only China specialists use Google or AI translation to understand China, and there's so many mistakes, unfortunately. So now I think the Americans need to make up to that the Chinese understand American much better than the Americans understand China.
Okay, thank you very much. Looks like we'll not be able to solve the problem today. And I'm aware of the time. Really running out of time. But I want to. We can do another session if you like. To cover this very interesting dialogue. But I want to go back to Sai. To do what we're here to do. That is to officially launch the books. So please go ahead.
Thank you, Prof. Zhu, and also to everyone who has sent in questions. I think the audience is very enthusiastic, and that shows the need for such a set that has been published. So at this point, please join me in congratulating Prof. Zhu and his leading scholars, contributors in the publication of this major reference set, Security, Development, and Sustainability in Asia, a world scientific reference on major policy and development issues of 21st century Asia. It is now officially launched. Thank you everyone for your time. And we also would like to take this opportunity to highlight that you can recommend this set to your library if you find it useful. And I think everyone here can see the need for the topics that are discussed in this set. And there will be a special introductory price as well until next year. So you can recommend it to your library by filling up a short form, and you can access the form by scanning the QR code shown on the screen. And we'll send the link into the chat later on as well. And so thank you very much for joining us tonight or this morning, wherever you are. I think it's been a very inspiring opportunity to hear from leading scholars on Asia. And for everyone who is concerned about Asia, this set should fill a very needful gap. And so thank you very much for honoring us with your presence today. We look forward to seeing you at future events. And congratulations once again to all contributors and to Prof. Zhu. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Congratulations, everybody. It's really a great honor to be with everybody. Thank you so much. And I'll be in touch in terms of how you can get the books. All right. Thank you. Have a wonderful evening or wonderful day. Thank you. See you soon. Bye-bye.